Hey guys, so for the past few days, I've had the opportunity to use the Canon R6. And first of all, I'm currently a Canon R owner and I love the R. And I was expecting when I got the R6 to, appreciate some of the upgrades, some of the performance improvements that they've brought to the R6. But in the end, to be like, it's cool, but I don't need it. First of all, there's the fact that the R is 30 megapixels, the R6 is only 20 megapixels. There's the whole overheating drama, but I have to say, after just a few days of using the R6, I really want this camera. So in this video, I'm gonna talk about why it surprised me, what I like so much about this camera, and what you may really like or may not like about the R6. All right, so first the specs. Not gonna spend a whole lot of time here, but it is a 20.1 megapixel full frame sensor, and we have Canon's new dual pixel AF version 2 focusing on the sensor, which is really, really great. Surprised me how good it works. And you can focus on 100% of the sensor. So whether you're focusing on the back LCD screen or in the electronic viewfinder, from corner to corner, you can put your focus points anywhere and it will autofocus on that for you. We also have face and eye detect for people and animals now. That's also really great in this camera. For photo, we can shoot up to 12 frames per second with a mechanical shutter, which is pretty crazy already. But if you switch to electronic shutter, you can shoot up to 20 frames per second and it is crazy fast. For video, we can shoot 10-bit 422 in C-Log at 4K up to 60 frames per second, or 1080 up to 120 frames per second. And we keep all of our autofocus performance in all of those modes. It works really well. And then in this camera, we also have 2 UHS 2 SD card slots. So with ergonomics, this camera is really comfortable and fun to shoot with. It has a big beefy grip. I will say when I first got it out of the box, I was a little worried because it felt like my pinky was slipping off the bottom just a little bit. That's one of the things that I love about the R so much, is that my whole hand fits on there automatically. But I will say, as soon as I started shooting with it, I didn't have that feeling at all, and it was really comfortable to shoot with. But if your hands are a little bigger, if your fingers are falling off a little bit, there is of course a battery grip available that you can add to this. And while we're talking about battery grips, the battery in this camera is Canon's newest version of their LPE6. It's the LPE6NH. And that's a long name, but I do appreciate the fact that Canon has kept backwards and forwards compatibility with their batteries, so that if you still have LPE6 or LPE6N batteries lying around from older Canon cameras, you can still use them in this camera as well, although they won't have the same battery life and performance as the new LPE6NH battery. For the electronic viewfinder, we have a 3.69 million dot OLED EVF, which is the same resolution as the R, and I think the R's viewfinder is great. But in the R6, we also have the ability to set it to 120 frames per second refresh rate, which is really great. And the viewfinder in this camera is awesome. It's not the best viewfinder on the market, but I have not had any complaints with it. And honestly, getting to electronic viewfinders this resolution and above, the differences become more and more incremental. We also have a 3-inch vari-angle LCD screen on the back. I was a little bit worried because it's slightly smaller than on the R, but the LCD screen is great and I didn't have any problem seeing it in bright daylight or using it in any situation. I was absolutely happy with it, and it is vari-angle, which people might have their own preferences on which type of screen they like, vari-angle or just flip out or just flat against the back of the camera. But the vari-angle is definitely objectively the most useful because you can see the screen from more positions. So one thing about the R6 I was not looking forward to is that it has the old school mode dial rather than the buttons that you can change your mode through, like the R and the R5. And I will say I definitely prefer how the R and the R5 does it. I would prefer to hit the 3 buttons because I can leave my eye through the viewfinder or leave my eye on the back screen and not have to tilt the camera down and look at what mode I'm changing it into. But at the same time, this is pretty standard and has been on cameras for forever. Most cameras still use this method. It's not the end of the world, but I do prefer the version that the R has. And speaking of dials and controls on this camera has 3 dials that you can set. What I have it set to is the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and that makes using the camera really easy, really quick, really intuitive. It also has a dedicated joystick that you can set for moving AF points around the screen, and I always used the touch and drag AF on the R, and I've never had any issue with it, and I thought like, well, I probably am not going to need a joystick because I'm already used to using the touch and drag and it works really well. However, once I started using the joystick, I was really glad I had it and didn't use the touch and drag on the R6 anymore because the joystick works so well. So I will say I have become kind of a convert on that part specifically. As far as ports on this camera, we have mic, remote shutter, headphone. The HDMI is a micro HDMI port, which a lot of people aren't necessarily going to be happy about. We have USB-C, and this camera does allow for USB-C charging, but just like with the R, you have to have a power delivery USB-C charger going through it. I will say that I have used my MacBook Pro charger and it worked fine to charge the R6. There are other power delivery USB-C chargers that you can use. You just have to make sure that it is rated for power delivery. And then of course we have the RF mount on here, which I am a huge fan of the RF mount. It's super versatile. The actual RF lenses that we have that are coming out are great. We're also getting more budget lenses on the RF mount. And with the adapters that we have, we can use EF and EFS lenses seamlessly on RF mount cameras. All right, so in photography, and honestly, I thought this was going to be the less exciting part about this camera because when you think about it just from megapixel standpoint, 30 megapixels to 20 megapixels definitely seems like a step back. But keep in mind, this seems to be the sensor from the 1DX Mark III, and that is a $6,000 camera. And the image quality coming off this sensor is awesome. The colors, even in raw, completely unedited images, the colors already look great. The dynamic range is definitely a step up from the R, and from what I've seen, I think it definitely competes with the other mirrorless cameras in the R6's class. And as far as handling and performance of actually shooting photography with this camera, it is game-changing for mirrorless cameras in the R6's class. 12 frames per second mechanically and 20 frames per second electronically, and the AF on this is just ridiculous. It's so accurate. If you miss focus on a photo, it's because you messed up. Like, this thing just does not miss focus. I was shooting bursts of photos with my subject walking towards me, walking beside me, walking away from me, and every single one was still in focus for the entire burst. It's really ridiculous, and the days of deleting photos just based off of whether they're in focus or not, gone. The animal autofocus, from my no scientific testing, but from my feeling, what I've seen and used with the Sony a7S III versus this, the R6 animal eye autofocus seems to be the most reliable that I've used personally. One thing I will say is I wish that there was an option just in the quick cue menu to be able to switch between eye detect for animals and people, because right now you have to go into the actual menu and change that setting, and that can be slow if you're going back and forth between shooting people and animals. But once you get the settings right, the performance is really great. My dog has like long eyebrows that tend to cover his actual eyes. It's really hard to get a shot of him where the eyes are in focus, especially as fast as he's typically moving around. But this R6 handled it really well, and I got a lot of shots that were in focus, even when I was shooting a lot of shots in a row with him. So to the issue about 20 megapixels, 20 megapixels down from 30 does seem like a lot, but I will say for most cases, 20 megapixels is fine. If you have never been in the situation where you have to make sure that you have enough megapixels for something, 20 megapixels is going to be fine for you. Even if you're printing large, 20 megapixels is going to be fine. I've actually printed 24 by 36 from an 18 megapixel camera, and it looked great. The clients were happy with it. It's still hanging in their home right now. So 20 megapixels is definitely going to be enough for most use cases. You're even going to be able to crop in a little bit depending on what you're using it for. If you're using it for social media, you can still crop in a decent amount and be fine, have plenty of resolution. I will say that when you're zooming in on these images, going from the 30 megapixels of the R to the 20 megapixels of the R6, you can definitely tell there is a difference. You have more room to crop and zoom in on the 30 megapixel files. But if you're not doing a crazy amount of cropping, if you're not zooming into a crazy amount, 20 megapixels is going to be plenty for most use cases. And if your use case is something that 20 megapixels is not okay for, you probably already know it and don't really need to ask the question. One huge advantage with the lower megapixel count is how good these images look at higher ISO values. And photos coming off of here at 20,000 ISO and with just a little bit of noise reduction, even higher ISO values still look great. I was able to shoot at 51,200 ISO and be fine with the image. And I even had a few images that I shot at 102,000 ISO and they still looked fine. And that is mind-blowing, just absolutely crazy. I will say 102,000 ISO is not going to work in every situation all the time, but the fact that it can even work in any situation is just crazy. So then the in-body image stabilization, the IBIS on this camera is insane. But for me personally, IBIS for photography is definitely not a big deal. I don't shoot low shutter speeds handheld ever. It's not something I do. I don't shoot very telephoto. 85 is pretty much the most telephoto that I shoot almost ever. I don't even own actually a lens that is more telephoto than 85, so it's a really specific situation when I go beyond that. So IBIS for me in photography, it's not a big deal for me personally. However, the IBIS in this is great. And if you want IBIS for your photography, this is an awesome option for that. But for me, it actually has a couple drawbacks in photography. And that is if you're on a tripod, turning your camera on and off, the shutter going down, it can actually move the shutter because of the stabilization system. And that can cause you from shot to shot to have just ever so slightly different composition. And even the mechanical shutter going off from shot to shot can cause that as well, which is not a huge deal, except for some of the stuff that I do is compositing images together. And when they're slightly off like that, it just doesn't work. So in that specific situation of having it on a tripod and trying to get images to composite together in post, that's actually a disadvantage for me. However, I will say, as a photography camera, the R6 definitely blew me away. And if you're shooting mostly handheld, and honestly just for most photographers in most situations, it is going to be an amazing option for a photo camera. All right, so now to video, and this is where I was kind of worried about what might happen here, because honestly, with the R5 and the R6 announcement, like pretty much all we heard was overheating, overheating, overheating. And personally, from what I experienced, now I was using the newest firmware on this, which at the time was 1.2.0. So that has changed since the release of this camera. But with how I was using it and what I saw from it, overheating for the R6 has definitely been blown way out of proportion. I was shooting outdoors a lot in about 70-degree weather Fahrenheit, so Celsius, that's about 21 degrees. And indoors, never once did I even get an overheating warning. And when I was shooting a bunch of 4K 60 clips in a row, it actually tends to show less time available than it will actually be able to shoot, at least with this firmware. So for instance, the time would actually go down to 25 minutes, or if I was shooting a lot of clips for a longer time, maybe 20 minutes, but it was able to shoot longer than that. I will say, if you want to have the most available time to record in 4K 24, 4K 60, you need to be turning the camera off in between shots. I didn't do that, and I still never even got an overheating warning. So I really think the overheating has been blown out of proportion. In short bursts, I don't think you're going to have a problem with the 4K in this camera overheating. I also tested it for long form content, shooting in 4K 24 for longer periods of time, and it was indoors. It was about 70 degrees inside the house. I had it shooting for an hour straight. So I started it at 30 minutes. When I started it back, it said it had about 20 minutes left, but after 20 minutes, it was still going. No overheating warning. It recorded another full 30-minute clip. So that means I recorded 4K 24 for an hour straight without even getting an overheating warning. At that point, I just stopped, because for me, that's way more than enough. Of that hour-long recording in 4K 24, those two files were just over 70 gigabytes of data. If I'm filming long form content like that, and I think a lot of people are going to do it in 1080, and this camera doesn't overheat in 1080, if you are shooting long form content in 4K, I will just say this is not going to be the right option for you. And from someone like me, coming from something like the R, where 60 frames per second, the only option you have is in 1080 anyway, this is already a step up from that, because even in 1080, we have 10-bit 422 colors, and that is a definite upgrade from the 8-bit 420. And while we're on the topic of 10-bit 422 colors, let's talk about that, because the colors coming out of this camera are insane. The footage is just so nice and easy to grade. You have so much room, and the footage just doesn't fall apart like it does in 8-bit. When you're grading log footage in 8-bit, you have to be really careful, because if you push it too far, the footage can start falling apart pretty easily. And that is not the case here with this 10-bit footage. It was a dream to edit. And some people have been complaining about the colors in the camera being way too warm and having overly warm tones in the footage. And again, I shot in log, so you can change the colors to what you want. And again, you have a lot of room to play with those colors. I will say, yeah, the colors came out a little warmer, definitely warmer than what you would expect to come out of the R, but I didn't think it was crazy. And again, with that 10-bit color, it's really easy to just cool down those colors and get the colors to look exactly how you want. So I don't really think that's a disadvantage. Certainly not something that is a deal breaker from the footage, because you just have so much room to play with the colors in this footage. So now to dynamic range, and we only have C-Log right now, which is annoying. There's supposed to be releasing C-Log 3. It should have been on the camera from launch, so it's frustrating that we're still waiting for that. But I will say I was pleasantly surprised with the amount of dynamic range that we get from the R6, even in just normal C-Log, and it's definitely a step up from the R, and I was happy with it. Unless you're shooting in crazy high dynamic range situations, it's going to be fine for most cases. So 4K, we can shoot up to 60 frames per second. There's no 120 at 4K in this camera, but I typically shoot in 60 frames for my slow motion footage, because unless you're shooting action or something really fast moving, 120 frames tends to be too slow. So 60 is kind of the sweet spot for me personally. So the fact that we have 4K 60 in the R6 is actually perfect for me. The 4K on this camera in general is amazing, and probably the best 4K 60 on any mirrorless camera on the market right now, because on this camera we have actually 5.5K being downsampled to 4K. So something like the A7S III just has a native 4K sensor, and the 4K 60 looks good, but it's not going to be as much resolution and detail as the R6. And the R5 has the 8K sensor, and in 24 frames and 30 frames in the high quality mode, you can downsample the 8K to 4K, but that's not available in the 4K 60. So for specifically 4K 60, which is going to be a lot of what I would use this camera for, this is probably the best option on the market, certainly anywhere near this price range. And then, like I said, we do have the option to shoot at 120 frames per second, but it is in 1080. And I've heard some complaints that the 1080-120 is overly soft in the R6, and that has not been my experience at all. I think the 1080 actually looks like really solid 1080. And you have to keep in mind, 1080 is not 4K. So it's not going to look as good, as sharp, as detailed as the 4K 60. But for 1080, it's solid. And unless you just have to have your project delivered at native 4K resolution, I think the 1080-120 is going to be fine for most people. Okay, so let's talk about the IBIS, because the IBIS in this camera for video is amazing. Easily the best IBIS system on a full frame camera that I've ever used. Blows away what the A7S III does with their IBIS system, and I would say is really on par with what like the Panasonic does on their Micro Four Thirds system, which is crazy to think about. And when you pair this with lenses that have optical stabilization in them as well, the effect is just awesome, super smooth, a handheld shooter's dream. And even pairing it with lenses that aren't stabilized, I was shooting this with the new RF Nifty 50 that does not have stabilization. The footage still looked super smooth, really usable, and I was completely hand holding it and not even trying too hard to be super steady. And I was super happy with how steady this footage came out. Honestly, the performance of the IBIS in video for this camera is one of the things that I liked most about it and one of the reasons why I want this camera so much. Of course, we have seen and heard about the IBIS wobble. That is only going to affect you if you're shooting at ultra wide, something like 16, 15, wider than 20 millimeters. And I hate shooting that wide anyway. So for me, that's not even a question. If you like that, that's your prerogative, and then maybe this isn't the right option for you. All right, so low light performance. First of all, let me say, I don't recommend shooting at super high ISO levels. Even if your camera is capable of doing that, it's just not going to look as good as if you light your shot well. But sometimes, should be very rare, but sometimes there are situations where you are going to have to shoot high ISO depending on what type of projects you shoot, and the R6 will be more than capable of delivering that for you. High ISO performance is great, and even shooting at somehow over 100,000 ISO, the footage in C-Log was still usable, and that's crazy to me. And at the super high ISOs, like 100,000, something like that, I would honestly say that the R6 footage might be just a little bit more usable than the A7S III footage because it doesn't have as much in-camera sharpening, and so the highlights aren't as weird and smeared as they are on the A7S III. Again, this is nitpicky and a personal preference, and you shouldn't shoot at that high of an ISO anyway, but if you did, I would lean slightly towards picking the R6 rather than the A7S III. I will say, however, at the more usable range of the high ISO ranges that you probably shouldn't be shooting at, the A7S III is a better option because it has that second base ISO that the R6 doesn't have. So at around 12,800, the A7S III is going to be way cleaner than what the R6 would do. But all in all, this camera is not going to have problems shooting at high ISO values. All right, so now we have to talk about the H.265 files coming off of this camera, and it's rough. They are difficult to work with on even newer, faster, higher performance machines. They're just highly compressed. Most machines are gonna have a lot of trouble working with them. If you get this camera to shoot video, just accept that you're going to be using a proxy workflow. And here's my biggest con with this camera as a video shooter. You cannot record proxies to the second card or at all with the R6. And for me, that is by far the biggest flaw with this camera. I don't understand why they would have left that out, especially with the fact that you have to shoot H.265 files with this camera. And I gave Sony kind of a hard time with the A7S III about how difficult some of their file formats were to use. And this R6 doesn't even have the H.264 all-I options in any of your recording formats. So with the R6, you are gonna have to transcode your footage or be using a proxy workflow. You are not going to be able to, especially the 4K files, take them straight into your editing software and edit them straight. I will say with the R6, there are a couple caveats that make the fact that these files are so hard to work with a little bit easier to handle. And the first one is the price, because the R6 is $1,000 or more less expensive than the R5 and the A7S III. So then it's a little easier to deal with. Also, the fact that the media is SD cards. And unlike how the A7S III works, the media is not restricted in what it can record based solely on the class of card. So I was actually recording 4K 60 in C-Log 10-bit 422 on UHS-1 SD cards. They're fast UHS-1 SD cards, and I know that they can handle these write speeds, and it worked without any issue. That is another area where you can save a lot of money. And now to autofocus. And this was another area where I was worried, because I have seen people doing reviews on the R6 that I definitely trust who were having issues with the autofocus. And I was worried about that. I will say, again, I was using the newest firmware, which was 1.2.0. I had zero issues with autofocus whatsoever. In fact, this was the best autofocus experience I've ever had with a camera in video. The eye autofocus is amazing. Even when people were wearing masks and only their eyes were video, it caught the eye immediately, locked on, didn't lose it. I had no issues with the autofocus performance in video with this, and I would easily trust the autofocus even in quicker moving action shots. So that was a lot, because there's a lot here for the video in this camera, but basically this camera will outperform the needs of most mirrorless video shooters. But it is not going to be for someone who has to shoot long form content in 4K, especially if you're in warmer climates because of the overheating issues. All right, so who is this camera for? If you shoot handheld, whether photo or video, this camera is amazing. And for photographers, if you've never had to really think about, do I have enough megapixels for this project, for what I'm trying to do, 20 megapixels is going to be enough for you. Images coming off of the sensor are amazing, great colors, great dynamic range. I don't think you'll be disappointed at all. For video, I think this camera packs the most punch for a mirrorless camera at this price point, and even holds its own against cameras that are more expensive. Of course, if you have to shoot long form content in 4K, this is not going to be a good option for you, but if you're okay with doing it in 1080, it's a great option, and even better than something like the R or the A7 III for that, because the 1080 will at least be in 10-bit 422 color space. And another thing that I actually didn't mention is that if you are shooting in 4K or 4K 60, you do have the option of shooting in the cropped mode, and that is going to help with the overheating as well. However, it's not going to be downsampled from 5.5K, it's just going to be native resolution 4K, which is not going to be something to complain about, except that you're not going to have the full field of view that you would with shooting in full frame. So personally, I think this R6 is easily one of the best values for the price that it's at. And I actually have a decision to make myself, which is, should I invest in the R6 for my business? Because it is a step up from the R in pretty much every aspect, except that I'm going from 30 megapixels to 20 megapixels. It can easily handle all of the stuff that I shoot, and I really want the camera. So I have to make a decision about that. But I hope that my thoughts and my experiences with this camera have helped you. If you enjoyed it, hit the thumbs up button. Let me know in the comments, are you looking at this camera? Are you thinking about getting this camera? Are you looking at other cameras? If so, which cameras are you looking at? If you are interested in buying this camera or any of the other gear I've mentioned, I'll have affiliate links in the description down below. If you purchase through those links at no extra cost to you, you can help support this channel so that I can keep making videos for you guys. If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button. See ya.